view is that every vote matters. And the way we can make that happen is that we can have national voting, and that means get rid of the Electoral College and every vote counts.
That's Senator Elizabeth Warren. She is one of several 2020 Democrats who want to change the way we elect our presidents. Now, if there was no Electoral College and the popular vote was all that mattered, of course, Hillary Clinton would be our president today, and Al Gore would have won the White House in 2000 instead of George W. Bush. Two recent court cases about the Electoral College could get all the way to the Supreme Court. The first comes from Colorado, where an elector voted for John Kasich instead of Hillary Clinton in 2016, even though Clinton won the state. That guy was replaced with somebody who did choose Hillary, but a federal court ruled that Colorado violated the Constitution. In Washington, that state Supreme Court ruled that electors could be fined if they don't pick the candidate who got the most votes. And just like in nearly everything else these days, this issue is deeply divided along party lines. A recent poll shows that only 20% of Democrats want to keep the Electoral College. 6 in 10 want to get rid of it. For Republicans, it's just about the opposite. 64% say they want to keep the Electoral College. Only 25% want it abolished. Gerrymandering is another major factor. That's the process that allows lawmakers to draw congressional districts to favor their own party and hurt the other party. That results in districts that look like these, that make absolutely no sense, no rhyme, no reason, no nothing. A piece in the New York Times describes how this practice is benefiting Republicans. Quote, in blue-leaning states, it is easy enough for Republican governments to draw heavily Democratic districts anchored in cities, then divvy up the rest of the state to their advantage, as they did in Pennsylvania or Michigan. In red-leaning states, they can break up cities into multiple Republican-leaning districts, as they have in Utah or Ohio. Overall, gerrymandering probably gives the Republicans about 10 more seats than they would have had otherwise. My next guest is an expert on election law. Joshua Douglas is a law professor at the University of Kentucky. He is also the author of Vote for Us, How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting. Professor, lots of talk in the news lately about abolishing the Electoral College or reforming it or working to make it irrelevant. We know it's led to 2 election wins for the candidate who did not win the most votes over the past 20 years. But is that the best way to judge the fairness or unfairness of the Electoral College? What other data points are out there and what do they say?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one way to judge the fairness, is that the will of the electorate really isn't being demonstrated in the winner. When you have an election that's really a nationwide referendum. You know, we're not living in the 1700s or 1800s where it's hard to run a national election and the states really do have more autonomy. Candidates campaign nationwide now. And so I think it is a good data point that it's very strange when you have a majority winner not actually winning the election.
We also hear a lot of talk about voter value or vote power. For example, given state populations and electoral votes, a voter in Wyoming's vote is 3.5 times more powerful than a voter in California. Is that, to your mind, an argument that the Electoral College needs to go?
I think there's lots of arguments for why the Electoral College needs to go. That's certainly one of them, that, you know, the value of your vote makes more of a difference depending on where you live in. I think maybe more compelling is that the presidential election really comes down to 5 or 6 states in most years. And so the candidates spend all of their time in, you know, those battleground states. There's a reason you see lots of visits to Pennsylvania and Florida and Ohio. It's because those are the states that are going to make a difference. You know, we add Michigan, Wisconsin, perhaps after 2016. If you had a nationwide vote, you know, the argument goes, well, the candidates are only going to spend their time in the cities. That's not actually true. I mean, you would actually need to go to less populated areas just to gather a majority.
But would that mean less representation in that election for rural voters? I understand urban voters and candidates would go to cities, so you'd also get the suburbs, but would that be unfair to rural voters?
You know, I don't think so, because you still have a need to go to more rural areas. You know, if you look at populations, you have, you know, the top 50 cities. If you get down to number 50 in terms of population, those are in more rural states. But that said, why should we be so concerned that farms have more voting power? I understand that we're agrarian or have an agrarian history, and I'm not trying to denigrate farmers and people in rural areas, but at the same time, we have a theory of democracy of one person, one vote, and so shouldn't our democracy reflect that?
Well, what if the states weren't winner take all? 48 of them are, but what about states that divide their electoral districts, or electoral vote rather, by congressional districts like Maine and Nebraska? Would that make the Electoral College more fair?
I think it's on the path to making it more fair, certainly. And so that's one proposal, and I know some states have looked into doing that. But again, it's not clear to me why, in this day and age, we need a system that is so state-based. I understand the rationale for it when our country was founded and given the type of politics that we had and the type of campaigning we had. Congressional district elections could make a little bit more sense, but we already have congressional representation through the House of Representatives, and we have statewide representation through the U.S. Senate. So it's not clear to me why the national leader should also have that same basis of representation.
I get the argument that some people suggest that it's unfair, but then this is one of those deals where everybody knew the rules of the game before the election. It's a little bit like a ball player complaining about 3 strikes and you're out after a strikeout. He's upset about the outcome, but he knew the rules going in. I'm just wondering, shouldn't, in this case, Democrats who have been on the short end of the stick twice in the last 20 years just play the game better?
Well, that's certainly part of it, and I'm not suggesting that the election was not legitimate for any reason, that Hillary Clinton should have been the winner. I mean, who knows? Donald Trump may have won in a national popular vote type of system. So this is not about looking backwards. It's about looking forward to what kind of presidency, what kind of representation do we think is fairest for a democracy that values every person's vote and should value every person's vote equally.
What was the original intent of the Electoral College? Why the founders wanted it there in the first place? And to your mind, has it ever served that purpose?
Well, there's lots of reasons historically. You can go back to just the states' rights and the concern that this national government would overtake the power of the states. There was certainly concern about slavery at the time and whether this new national government would lead to the abolishment of slavery in the southern states, where the southern states at the time wanted to retain it. And then there's just a feeling that you wanted a president who would represent lots of parts of the country. And so you wouldn't just have a president that would be elected by one populous area. It probably did serve some purposes, whether those are good purposes or bad purposes. It probably did serve some purposes at the time, but I don't think that we could say that this serves the same kinds of purposes in today's democracy.
When it comes to fairness, Americans are pretty used to having a referee, for lack of a better term, to turn to in a dispute. You think you've been wrong, you take your case to a judge. Who are the judges when it comes to our elections? Who's supposed to keep them fair, and how political are those people and that process?
Well, there's lots of different people at different levels. You've got local election officials and statewide secretaries of states. And it's actually crazy that we elect the people who run our elections, often in partisan elections. You look at Georgia's now Governor Brian Kemp, who was Secretary of State running the election at the very time he was running in the election for next office. No other modern democracies have partisan elected officials running our elections. And then when you get to electoral disputes, you get to the judiciary. If you have a dispute in state court, and you're talking about, in most states, an elected official, sometimes explicitly partisan, sometimes not, or the federal judiciary, which at least is appointed in a perhaps less partisan way than, or at least hopefully the theory is, it'd be less partisan than state judges. And again, you could look to whether that actually is the case. I mean, sometimes these days, voting rights cases at the U.S. Supreme Court come down on a 5-4 vote, and we all kind of know which side is which, and that's unfortunate as well. What we really need is nonpartisan election officials and a broad, independent type of body that could resolve election disputes.
All of this talk about the Electoral College is one part of a wider conversation about making elections more fair in general. Some of the other ideas that I've heard quite a bit about lately include reorganizing the Senate or adding or condensing states, none of which are particularly likely to happen. I mean, a lot of them would require constitutional changes. That doesn't seem very likely. What are some more practical changes that we can make to make our elections more fair and more representative?
Yeah, this is the exact topic of my new book. called Vote for Us: How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting, which is about local and statewide reforms that are actually being implemented already. So you can talk about registration reform and the move to automatic voter registration or same-day voter registration. You can talk about election day convenience, where we have states moving to universal vote by mail, where every member of the electorate receives a ballot automatically without having to ask for it, and this improves turnout. Or the use of vote centers, which instead of having to vote at your home-based precinct, you can go to any vote center in the county and they're all connected. So if it's easier to vote closer to work or closer to school or wherever you are, you can go to that vote center there. We can talk about the adoption of ranked choice voting, which is being used in several cities and actually statewide in Maine, where voters, instead of having to choose one candidate, can rank order their preferences. There's redistricting reform, campaign finance reform happening at the local and state level, improved civics education, and all of these things are actually working and improving elections in lots of places, and those are the areas that I think we need to focus on.
That's a long list to choose from, Professor, which leads me to my final question. Let's assume that practicality was not an issue. I gave you the power to make one unitary change to our elections. Snap your fingers and it happens. What would that change be and why?
Well, if we're not talking about the practical aspects of it, I actually think that Australia has a pretty good system of universal voting where everyone is required to vote and there's a small fine if you don't. And you don't have to choose a candidate. You can select none of the above. I don't like any of these bums. And they have turnout of over 90%. They have a pretty engaged, informed electorate. The system really seems to work. So if we're not talking about practicalities at all, I think that one has a lot of power. If we do want to talk about practicalities, then I think there are places that some places are doing already, like automatic voter registration, like lowering the voting age to 16 for local elections. These things can have really powerful effects for American elections here.
Josh Douglas is a professor at the University of Kentucky School of Law. He is the author of Vote for Us: How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting. Professor, thanks for a few minutes.
Thanks for having me.
And up next, a first-hand account of the way our military operates and accomplishes in times of war.